Chicago, Illinois, July 27, 2025, 8 p.m. The Unity Studios stage shimmered under a cascade of golden lights, its polished wooden floor and crimson velvet chairs radiating an air of grandeur. The audience, a vibrant mix of curious onlookers and devoted fans, erupted in applause, their energy pulsing through the cavernous space as cameras swept across the crowd, broadcasting live to millions worldwide. At the heart of it all stood Maya Johnson, a 55-year-old black activist and media icon whose name was synonymous with empowerment and inclusivity. Her smile, radiant yet calculated, commanded the room as she welcomed viewers to her much-anticipated special, Spirituality for the 21st Century. Tonight, she had a plan to challenge the unyielding Christian faith of her guest, Senator John Neely Kennedy, a 73-year-old conservative from Louisiana, known for his blunt honesty and deep-rooted beliefs. Maya, with her empire built on universal spirituality and high-priced courses, believed she could expose Kennedy's convictions as outdated in a world that celebrated diversity. But as the lights blazed and the crowd hushed, she had no idea that this moment, this man, would unravel her carefully curated narrative in ways she could never have foreseen. The stage was a masterpiece of design, its sleek lines and warm hues crafted to evoke intimacy and openness. Maya, dressed in a flowing emerald gown, stood with the poise of a woman who had mastered the art of media. Her voice, smooth as velvet, carried a hint of challenge as she addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Spirituality for the 21st Century, where we explore the paths that guide us, the truths that shape us, and the hope that unites us in a world of endless possibilities. The crowd roared, their excitement palpable, many of them devotees of Maya's books and online courses, which promised peace and purpose through meditation, self-discovery, and ancient wisdom, rebranded for the modern age. She turned to her guest, her smile widening, but her eyes sharp with intent. Tonight, we're honored to have Senator John Neely Kennedy from Louisiana. Senator, welcome to the show. The audience clapped politely as Kennedy stepped onto the stage, his navy suit tailored but understated, a stark contrast to the polished spectacle around him. At 73, his face bore the lines of a life spent in service, first as a lawyer, then as a senator, always as a man of faith. In his jacket pocket, he carried a small Bible and a worn, folded letter, not for show but as quiet anchors of his purpose. He moved with an unhurried calm, his gray hair catching the light, his blue eyes warm yet steady. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his voice low and laced with the unmistakable drawl of Louisiana's bayou country. "I'm glad to be here." He settled into his chair, hands resting lightly on his knees, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man who knew the ground. He stood on. The audience sensed it too, a subtle tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and expectation. Kennedy wasn't your average politician. He was the kind who spoke openly about his Christian faith, even when it drew accusations of being rigid or divisive. Maya, ever the master of her domain, leaned forward, her smile as inviting as ever, but her eyes betraying a glint of calculation. "Senator, it's a privilege to have you with us," she said, her tone warm but deliberate. "We're in for a fascinating conversation about spirituality, hope, and what guides us through life's challenges." Kennedy nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I look forward to it, Maya," he replied, his voice carrying a sincerity that felt almost out of place in the polished world of live television. He wasn't naive. He'd heard about Maya's ventures, her online courses that cost thousands, her partnerships with New Age gurus, her knack for turning spiritual platitudes into profitable products. He hadn't come to judge her, but he'd prayed quietly before arriving, asking for wisdom and courage to speak truth, no matter the cost. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about standing for something bigger. Maya started with soft questions, easing the audience into the conversation. She asked about his work in the Senate, how he connected with the people of Louisiana, and the challenges of navigating a polarized political landscape. Kennedy answered with ease, tossing in a touch of Southern humor that drew chuckles from the crowd. He spoke of meeting constituents, farmers in overalls, teachers in small-town schools, preachers in weathered churches, painting a picture of a man rooted in the lives of ordinary people. The audience warmed to him, their laughter genuine, their faces softening as he shared stories of resilience and community. But Maya wasn't here for small talk. She shifted gears, her tone sharpening just enough to signal a change, like a conductor preparing to strike a new note. "Senator," she said, her smile still in place, but her eyes narrowing slightly. "You often talk about your Christian faith in your speeches. You've called it the cornerstone of your life. But in a diverse world like ours, where people find meaning in so many ways through meditation, self-discovery, ancient traditions, don't you think it's a bit outdated to insist there's only one path to God?" The question landed like a well-aimed dart, striking at the heart of Kennedy's publicly professed Christianity. The audience fell silent, their eyes darting between Maya and Kennedy, waiting for his response. Some leaned forward, intrigued by the challenge. In a culture that prized inclusivity and open-mindedness, the idea of one exclusive path to God felt rigid, almost confrontational. Maya knew this and was banking on it. She expected Kennedy to either defend his beliefs and appear narrow, or soften his stance and undermine his faith. It was a trap, and she was confident she'd set it perfectly. Kennedy didn't flinch. He met Maya's gaze, then turned to the audience, his eyes warm and steady, the kind of look that made you feel seen. "Maya, let me tell you about Sarah, a woman from New Orleans," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of a storyteller who knew his tale mattered. Sarah's a single mom. Lost her husband in a car accident a few years back. She's raising 3 kids on a cashier's paycheck, barely scraping by. Life hasn't been kind to her, but every morning, she sits at her kitchen table and prays. Not for money or an easier life, but for the strength to keep going. She told me her faith in Jesus is the only thing that gets her through the light. In her darkest days, the story hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. The audience, accustomed to lofty spiritual rhetoric or polished sound bites, felt the raw truth of Sarah's struggle. A few people dabbed at their eyes, moved by the simplicity of Kennedy's words. Others nodded, as if Sarah's story had unlocked something deep within them. Maya, though still smiling, hadn't expected this. She'd prepared for a theological sparring match, not a personal story that grounded faith in the grit of everyday life. She jumped in quickly, trying to steer the conversation back to her terms. "That's a beautiful story, Senator," she said, her tone carrying a hint of condescension, as if gently correcting a wayward guest. "But my question wasn't about personal experiences. I'm asking whether your faith, with its claim that there's only one way to God, is appropriate to impose on a diverse society where people have the right to choose their spiritual paths." The question was sharper now, more pointed, designed to put Kennedy on the defensive. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement with Maya. She was, after all, the champion of open-hearted spirituality, the woman who'd brought mindfulness and self-help into mainstream America. Kennedy, with his unapologetic Christianity, seemed to stand in opposition to that ethos of acceptance. The camera zoomed in, capturing the moment's intensity, the faint tightening of Maya's jaw, the calm resolve in Kennedy's eyes. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He nodded, acknowledging the question's weight, then leaned forward slightly. "Maya, I'm not imposing anything on anybody," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to force anyone to believe what I do. But you asked about my faith, and I've got to be honest. Jesus said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.' Those aren't my words, they're his. If I believe that, I must share it, not to bully folks, but to invite them. People can choose what they want, but I can't stay quiet about what I know to be true." The words landed with a force that silenced the room. The audience sat still, absorbing the conviction in Kennedy's voice. Some clapped softly, not out of blind agreement but out of respect for his courage. He hadn't attacked anyone or raised his voice, yet his words carried a clarity that cut through the haze of vague spirituality. Maya, for the first time in her storied career, felt the ground shift beneath her. She'd expected to control this exchange, to guide it toward her vision of inclusive, marketable spirituality. But Kennedy, with his quiet resolve, was turning this into something else, a moment of truth that demanded attention. Sensing she was losing her grip, Maya pressed harder, her voice taking on a steely edge. "Senator, you talk about absolute truth, about one way to God, but do you believe that billions of people around the world who follow other faiths or none at all are wrong? Doesn't your faith make you judgmental of them?" The question was a masterstroke, a rhetorical landmine. If Kennedy said yes, he'd be painted as arrogant and intolerant. If he said no, he'd contradict his own beliefs. The audience leaned in, the tension thick enough to choke on. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in approval of Maya's challenge. She was their icon, the voice of reason in a world of dogma, and they trusted her to expose any hint of hypocrisy. Kennedy paused, not out of uncertainty but to gather his thoughts. He closed his eyes for a split second, a silent prayer for wisdom. Then he looked at Maya, his gaze steady and kind. "Maya, truth doesn't bend to numbers or feelings," he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "If I believe a bridge is broken, I'm not going to tell folks to walk across it, no matter how much they believe it's safe. My faith isn't about judging people, it's about warning them and offering hope. I'm not saying everyone else is wrong just because they're different. I'm saying I've found a path, and I want to share it with anyone who'll listen." The analogy was simple but devastating. The audience erupted in scattered applause, some clapping hesitantly, others with conviction. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the power of Kennedy's sincerity. Maya's smile tightened, her composure fraying at the edges. She hadn't anticipated this, a politician who didn't dodge or deflect but met her challenge head-on with a blend of humility and resolve. "That's an interesting perspective, Senator," she said, her voice betraying a hint of strain. "We'll dive deeper into this after a quick break." As the stage lights dimmed and the show cut to commercial, Maya glanced at Kennedy, her eyes a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. She knew the next segment would be even more intense, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she'd come out on top. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat quietly, his gaze drifting to the audience, his heart whispering a prayer. He reached into his pocket, touching the folded letter, its worn edges a reminder of why he was here. The battle wasn't over, and what came next could change everything. The crowd buzzed during the break, their whispers a mix of awe and debate. Some were moved by Kennedy's stories, others were skeptical of his unyielding stance. Maya's team huddled backstage, adjusting their strategy, sensing the shift in the room. Maya herself took a moment to breathe, her mind racing. She'd built an empire on the idea that spirituality was a tapestry of paths, each valid, each marketable. Her courses, priced at thousands, promised transformation through mindfulness and self-discovery. Her books topped bestseller lists, and her retreats sold out in hours. But Kennedy's words, grounded in the struggles of people like Sarah, challenged the foundation of her work. They weren't polished or packaged, they were raw, real, and piercingly honest. She felt a flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed. She was Maya Johnson, the woman who'd empowered millions. She wouldn't let a senator from Louisiana unravel her legacy. As the commercial break ended, the lights snapped back on, bathing the stage in a warm glow. The audience settled, their anticipation electric. Maya straightened in her chair, her smile returning, though it lacked its earlier ease. Kennedy sat unchanged, his hands clasped, his face a portrait of calm resolve. The cameras rolled, and the world watched, unaware that this clash of worldviews was about to become a reckoning. Maya leaned forward, her voice steady but carrying an edge. "Welcome back, everyone," she said, addressing the audience with her trademark warmth. "We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, exploring faith, truth, and what it means to find meaning in today's world. Senator, you've shared some compelling thoughts, and I appreciate your candor." She paused, letting the audience absorb her gracious tone, a signal that she was still in charge. "But let's get real for a moment. As a politician, you've used your faith to connect with voters, to present yourself as a man of principle. Some might say that's a form of manipulation, leveraging people's emotions to win their trust. How do you respond to that?" The question was a grenade, lobbed with precision to undermine Kennedy's integrity. The audience stirred, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. In the world of politics, accusations of exploiting faith for votes were as old as time, and Maya knew it. She was banking on Kennedy stumbling, either by getting defensive or dodging the question, which would make him look like just another opportunistic politician. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression on his face. Kennedy didn't blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded letter, its edges worn from handling. He held it up briefly, not for show but as if it grounded him, then set it on his knee. "Maya," he said, his voice steady and warm, "let me tell you about Jacob, a 10-year-old boy from New Orleans." The audience leaned in, caught off guard by the shift. Kennedy's tone was soft but commanding, the kind that made you hang on every word. "Jacob's been in and out of the hospital. Most of his life leukemia. His mama wrote me this letter a while back. Said Jacob watched one of my speeches on TV. I'd talked about faith, about how God's love gives us hope even when the world feels like it's falling apart. Jacob grabbed his mama's hand and said, 'Mama, if that man says God loves me, I ain't scared anymore.'" Kennedy paused, his eyes sweeping the audience. Not for effect, but because he wanted them to feel Jacob's story. The studio fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. A few audience members wiped tears from their eyes, their faces soft with emotion. Others nodded, as if Jacob's story had unlocked something deep within. Then Maya, caught off guard, felt a flicker of unease. She'd expected a political dodge, not a story that cut straight to the heart. Her empire was built on stories, on connecting with people's emotions, but Kennedy's tale wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw, unfiltered, and undeniably real. She recovered quickly, her media training kicking in. "That's a powerful story, Senator," she said, her voice measured but with a hint of strain. "And I don't doubt that it resonates with many people, but let's broaden the conversation. You emphasize one-path Christianity as the truth. Don't you think that's a limited perspective in a global world where people find meaning through countless spiritual traditions?" The question was a pivot, a way to pull the discussion back to safer, more abstract ground. Maya was the queen of framing spirituality as a universal tapestry, where all paths, Buddhism, meditation, self-help, led to the same destination. Kennedy's insistence on one truth threatened that vision, and she needed to expose its flaws. The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding as if Maya had voiced their thoughts. Kennedy, however, didn't hesitate. He leaned back slightly, his hands clasped, and gave her a look that was both respectful and unflinching. "Maya, I respect that folks find meaning in all sorts of ways," he said. "I'm not here to tell anybody they can't search for truth, wherever they want. But let me ask you something. If you knew a child was about to walk into a burning building, would you tell them there are lots of ways to get out, or would you point them to the one safe exit? The analogy hit like a thunderbolt, simple but piercing. The audience gasped softly, some clapping before they even realized it. Kennedy's words cut through the fog of relativism with a clarity that was both disarming and profound. He wasn't attacking other beliefs, he was making a case for urgency, for truth as a matter of life and death. Maya's smile faltered for a split second, her mind racing to find a counterpoint. She hadn't expected him to turn the question back on her, and the audience's reaction scattered applause. Nods of understanding told her she was losing ground. That's a vivid metaphor, Senator, she said, her tone clipped but still professional. But you're sidestepping the issue. My work, my courses, my books, they've helped millions find peace and purpose. Are you saying that's meaningless? Just because it doesn't align with your faith? The question was a trap, designed to paint Kennedy as dismissive of her legacy. If he criticized her work, he'd alienate the audience, who revered Maya as a beacon of hope. If he endorsed it, he'd dilute his message. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the stakes. Kennedy paused, not out of hesitation but to choose his words carefully. He looked at Maya, his eyes filled with a compassion that caught her off guard. Maya, he said softly, I don't doubt you've helped folks feel better. Your kindness, your encouragement, that's real, and it matters. But feeling better isn't the same as being saved. Your courses might ease someone's pain, for a while, but they can't answer the big questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? My faith says only Jesus has those answers, and I'd be lying if I said anything else. The studio went quiet, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Kennedy's words weren't harsh, but they were unrelenting, exposing the gap between temporary comfort and eternal truth. The audience, many of whom had spent thousands on Maya's courses or retreats, felt a stirring in their hearts. They'd been sold promises of peace and abundance, but Kennedy was offering something different, something free, yet infinitely costly. Maya, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, felt the spotlight shift. For the first time, she wasn't the one guiding the narrative. As the segment ended and the show cut to another break, she looked at Kennedy, her eyes a mix of defiance and dawning respect. The battle wasn't over, but the stage was set for a reckoning that would change everything. The lights of Unity Studios flared back to life, their golden glow bathing the stage in a warmth that belied the electric tension. In the air, the audience, still reeling from the raw intensity of the first segment, settled into their crimson velvet seats, their eyes darting between Maya Johnson and Senator John Neely Kennedy. What had begun as a polished talk show special, spirituality, for the 21st century, had morphed into something far more visceral, a clash of worldviews that felt less like a discussion and more like a reckoning. Maya, her usual confidence, shaken by Kennedy's unflinching sincerity, sat with a tightened smile, her emerald gown catching the light as she leaned forward, determined to regain control. She'd built an empire on her ability to steer narratives, to weave a tapestry of inclusive spirituality that resonated with millions. But Kennedy, with his quiet conviction and southern drawl, was proving an immovable force. His words piercing the heart of her carefully constructed vision. As the cameras rolled, capturing every flicker of emotion, Maya's voice cut through the hush, smooth but carrying a subtle edge, like a blade wrapped in silk. Welcome back, everyone, she said, addressing the audience with a practiced warmth that masked her unease. We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, exploring faith, truth, and what it means to find meaning in today's world. Senator, you've shared some compelling stories, and I appreciate your candor. She paused, letting her gracious tone linger, a signal to the audience that she remained in command. But beneath her polished exterior, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her. Kennedy's stories about Sarah, the single mother from New Orleans, and his unapologetic defense of his Christian faith had shifted the room's energy. The audience, her audience, was no longer just hers. They were hanging on his words, their faces a mix of awe, emotion, and curiosity. Maya straightened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and pressed forward with a question designed to put Kennedy back on the defensive. But let's get real for a moment, Senator, she said, her voice steady but laced with a challenge. As a politician, you've used your faith to connect with voters, to present yourself as a man of principle. Some might say that's a form of manipulation, leveraging people's emotions to win their trust. How do you respond to that? The question was a grenade, lobbed with precision to undermine Kennedy's integrity. The audience stirred, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. In the world of politics, accusations of exploiting faith for votes were as old as time, and Maya knew it. She was banking on Kennedy stumbling either by getting defensive or dodging the question, which would paint him as just another opportunistic politician. The camera zoomed in, capturing the faint lines on his weathered face, the calm resolve in his blue eyes. Kennedy didn't blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded letter, its edges worn from handling, as if it were a talisman grounding him in the moment. He held it up briefly, not for show, but as a quiet reminder of his purpose, then set it on his knee. Maya, he said, his voice steady and warm, carrying the cadence of Louisiana's bayou country. Let me tell you about Jacob, a 10-year-old boy from New Orleans. The audience leaned in, caught off guard by the shift. Kennedy's tone was soft but commanding, the kind that drew you in and held you there. Jacob's been in and out of the hospital most of his life. Leukemia, his mama wrote me this letter. A while back, said Jacob watched one of my speeches on TV. I'd talked about faith, about how God's love gives us hope even when the world feels like it's falling apart. Jacob grabbed his mama's hand and said, "Mama, if that man says, God loves me, I ain't scared anymore." Kennedy paused, his eyes sweeping the audience, not for effect but to let Jacob's story sink in. The studio fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. A few audience members wiped tears from their eyes, their faces softening with emotion. Others nodded, as if Jacob's courage had stirred something deep within them. Maya, caught off guard, felt a flicker of unease ripple through her. She'd expected a political dodge, a rehearsed soundbite, not a story that cut straight to the heart. Her empire was built on stories, carefully curated tales of transformation that fueled her books, courses, and retreats. But Kennedy's story wasn't polished or packaged for mass appeal. It was raw, unfiltered, and undeniably real, rooted in the pain and hope of a child facing mortality. She recovered quickly, her media training kicking in, her voice measured but carrying a hint of strain. "That's a powerful story, Senator," she said, her smile tight but professional. "And I don't doubt that it resonates with many people. But let's broaden the conversation. You emphasize one path, Christianity, as the truth. Don't you think that's a limited perspective in a global world where people find meaning through countless spiritual traditions?" The question was a pivot, a calculated move to pull the discussion back to safer ground, where Maya could shine. She was the queen of framing spirituality as a universal mosaic, where paths like Buddhism, meditation, and self-discovery all led to the same destination. Kennedy's insistence on one truth threatened that vision, and she needed to expose its flaws. The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding as if Maya had voiced their thoughts. Her work had empowered millions to embrace their spiritual journeys, free from dogma or exclusivity. Kennedy, with his unapologetic Christianity, seemed to challenge that freedom. But Kennedy didn't hesitate. He leaned back slightly, his hands clasped, and gave her a look that was both respectful and unflinching. "Maya, I respect that folks find meaning in all sorts of ways," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I'm not here to tell anybody they can't search for truth wherever they want. But let me ask you something. If you knew a child was about to walk into a burning building, would you tell them there are lots of ways to get out, or would you point them to the one safe exit?" The analogy hit like a thunderbolt, simple yet piercing, cutting through the fog of relativism with a clarity that was both disarming and profound. The audience gasped softly, some clapping before they even realized it. Kennedy wasn't attacking other beliefs, he was making a case for urgency, for truth as a matter of life and death. Maya's smile faltered for a split second, her mind racing to find a counterpoint. She hadn't anticipated him turning the question back on her, and the audience's reaction scattered applause. Nods of understanding told her she was losing ground. "That's a vivid metaphor, Senator," she said, her tone clipped but still professional. "But you're sidestepping the issue. My work, my courses, my books, they've helped millions find peace and purpose. Are you saying that's meaningless, just because it doesn't align with your faith?" The question was a trap, designed to paint Kennedy as dismissive of her legacy. If he criticized her work, he'd alienate the audience, who revered Maya as a beacon of hope. If he endorsed it, he'd dilute his message. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the stakes, their eyes darting between the two figures on stage. Kennedy paused, not out of hesitation, but to choose his words carefully. He looked at Maya, his eyes filled with a compassion that caught her off guard. "Maya," he said softly, "I don't doubt you've helped folks feel better. Your kindness, your encouragement, that's real, and it matters. But feeling better isn't the same as being saved. Your courses might ease someone's pain for a while, but they can't answer the big questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? My faith says only Jesus has those answers, and I'd be lying if I said anything else." The studio went quiet, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Kennedy's words weren't harsh, but they were unrelenting, exposing the gap between temporary comfort and eternal truth. The audience, many of whom had invested thousands in Maya's retreats or online programs, felt a stirring in their hearts. They'd been sold promises of peace and abundance. But Kennedy was offering something different, something free, yet infinitely costly. Maya's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles whitening as she felt the spotlight shift. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one guiding the narrative. Her empire rested on the idea that spirituality could be packaged and sold, a universal balm for the soul. But Kennedy's faith, rooted in the gritty reality of people like Sarah and Jacob, was a direct challenge to that model. She tried to rally, her voice rising slightly, a trace of defensiveness creeping in. Senator, you're talking about salvation as if it's exclusive to your beliefs. But what about the wisdom of other traditions? What about the billions who find joy and meaning outside Christianity? Are they all misguided? The audience clapped, emboldened by Maya's pushback. Kennedy didn't back down. He reached for the folded letter on his knee, holding it like a lifeline, his eyes steady but urgent. Maya, I'm not here to argue about who's right or wrong, he said, his voice firm yet laced with compassion. I'm here to share what I know. When I was younger, I looked for answers everywhere, books, philosophies, you name it, but nothing filled the hole in my heart until I met Jesus. Not a religion, not a system, but a person who said, "Come to me, and I'll give you rest." That's not arrogance, that's surrender. I'm just a man who found a lifeline, and I want to throw it to anyone who's drowning. The words landed like a tidal wave, washing over the audience with a force that left them breathless. Some clapped, others sat stunned, their minds wrestling with the weight of what they'd heard. Kennedy wasn't preaching, he was testifying, and the difference was palpable. His words carried the authenticity of a man who'd lived through his doubts and found something solid to stand on. Maya, her hands trembling slightly, felt a crack forming in her carefully curated facade. She'd spent decades building a spiritual empire, selling hope at a premium $2,000 for a weekend retreat, $500 for an online course, millions in book sales. Her message was universal. Everyone could find peace by looking within, by blending ancient wisdom with modern mindfulness. But Kennedy's message was free, unpolished, and piercingly honest, rooted in a truth that didn't bend to trends or market demands. The audience was no longer just watching her, they were looking at him, hanging on his every word. Desperate to reclaim control, Maya went for a final blow, her voice sharp now, cutting through the reverent hush. Senator, your faith is important to you, she said, her eyes narrowing. But let's be honest, you're a public figure, a man with influence. When you talk about Jesus as the only way, you're not just sharing a personal belief. You're shaping how people think, how they vote, and how they live. Isn't that a kind of power you're wielding, maybe even a dangerous one? The accusation was bold, implying that Kennedy's faith was a tool of control, a way to manipulate the masses. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others waiting to see how he'd respond. Maya leaned back, her smile tight, confident. She'd landed a decisive hit. Kennedy looked at her, his eyes soft but unwavering, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Maya, power's a funny thing, he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet intensity. You can use it to build yourself up, or you can use it to lift others. My faith isn't about control, it's about freedom. Freedom from fear, from guilt, from chasing things that don't last. I talk about Jesus because I've seen what he does for people like Jacob, like Sarah, like me. He held up the folded letter, his voice growing quieter but more forceful. This is a letter from Jacob's mama, sent last week, thanking me for giving her boy hope. That's why I'm here, Maya, not to win an argument, but to point people to the one who can carry them through. The studio erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of earlier, but a genuine outpouring of emotion. People were crying, nodding, and some even whispering prayers under their breath. Maya sat frozen, her face pale as the realization hit her. She wasn't just losing the debate, she was losing the audience. Kennedy's words had done what her empire never could. They'd touched something deeper, something eternal. Her courses offered temporary solace, a feel-good spirituality that faded when the money ran out. But Kennedy's faith was a lifeline, offered freely, demanding nothing but openness. The cameras caught the moment, a tear, glistening in the corner of Maya's eye, quickly blinked away, and the steady, compassionate gaze of Kennedy, his hand resting on the letter as if it held the weight of his mission. As the segment ended and the show cut to another commercial break, the audience's applause lingered, a mix of admiration and awe. Maya glanced at Kennedy, her eyes a complex blend of defeat and dawning respect. She'd spent her career orchestrating moments of inspiration, but this was different. This was unscripted, unpolished, and undeniable. Backstage, her producers scrambled, sensing the shift in the room, whispering about how to pivot the narrative. Maya took a deep breath, her hands still trembling, her mind racing. She'd built her empire on the idea that all paths led to the same truth, that spirituality could be a product, packaged and sold. But Kennedy's words had exposed a fault line in that vision, a question she couldn't ignore. What if her work, for all its good intentions, was pointing people to a temporary fix instead of an eternal truth? Kennedy, meanwhile, sat quietly, his gaze drifting to the audience, his heart whispering a prayer. He hadn't come to tear Maya down or to claim victory. He'd come to speak the truth, to offer a lifeline to anyone who would take it. The letter, from Jacob's mother, tucked back into his pocket, was a reminder of why he was here, not for fame or power, but for people like Jacob who needed hope that wouldn't fade. The stage lights dimmed, and the crowd's buzz grew louder, their conversations a mix of debate and wonder. Some were moved by Kennedy's sincerity, others were unsettled by his unyielding stance. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a talk show anymore. It was a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio, challenging everyone who heard it to confront the truths they held and the paths they followed. As the commercial break ticked by, Maya's team huddled backstage, their voices urgent but hushed. They knew the final segment would be pivotal, a chance to either reclaim the narrative or let Kennedy's message reshape the conversation entirely. Maya sat in her chair, her hands clasped tightly, her mind wrestling with the weight of what she'd heard. She was Maya Johnson, the woman who'd empowered millions, whose name was synonymous with hope and transformation. But for the first time, she felt exposed, as if Kennedy's words had peeled back the layers of her carefully crafted empire to reveal a deeper question. What was she offering the world? The cameras would roll again soon, and the next segment would test not just her skill as a host but her courage to face the truth Kennedy had laid bare. The stage was set for a reckoning, and neither she nor the audience could look away. Chapter 3. The Truth and the Grace, the lights of Unity Studios snapped back on, casting a golden glow over the stage that felt almost sacred, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of unspoken questions. The audience, still reeling from the electric intensity of the previous segments, sat in rapt silence, their eyes flickering between Maya Johnson and Senator John Neely Kennedy. What had begun as a polished talk show special, spirituality for the 21st century had transformed into something profound, a collision of hearts and truths that transcended the boundaries of a television broadcast. Maya, her usual unshakable confidence frayed by Kennedy's relentless sincerity, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her emerald gown shimmering under the lights, but her face betraying a flicker of vulnerability. She'd built a spiritual empire on the promise of universal hope, her courses and books guiding millions to find peace within themselves. But Kennedy, the 73-year-old senator from Louisiana, with his unassuming Navy suit and quiet conviction, had challenged the very foundation of her work, speaking of a truth that didn't bend to trends or market demands. As the cameras rolled, capturing every nuance of the moment, Maya took a deep breath, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Welcome back, everyone," she said, her tone carrying a warmth that felt more genuine than before, though a tremor lingered beneath it. "We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, exploring faith, truth, and what it means to find meaning. In today's world, Senator, you've given us a lot to think about. Your stories, your faith, they're powerful." She paused, her eyes searching Kennedy's face, as if seeking an anchor in the storm of emotions swirling within her. The audience leaned forward, sensing a shift in the air. Maya, the media titan who'd spent decades shaping narratives, was no longer in full control. Her empire of inclusive spirituality built on meditation, self-discovery, and ancient wisdom, repackaged for modern audiences, had been shaken by Kennedy's unyielding belief in a singular truth. His stories of Sarah, the single mother, and Jacob, the boy with leukemia, had grounded his faith in the raw realities of human struggle, making it impossible for Maya to dismiss him as dogmatic or out of touch. She swallowed, her hands trembling slightly, and pressed forward with a question that wasn't a trap but a plea, raw and unguarded. "Senator, I want to understand something," she said, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "How can you be so certain that your way, your Jesus, is the only truth? I've spent my life helping people find peace through all kinds of paths: meditation, self-discovery, and ancient wisdom. Are you saying all of that is wrong?" The question hung in the air, heavy with vulnerability. The audience held their breath, witnessing a crack in Maya's armor, a moment of honesty from a woman who'd always seemed invincible. Kennedy's eyes softened, but his gaze held steady, radiating a compassion that seemed to envelop the entire room. He reached for the folded letter on his knee, its worn edges a testament to its significance, not as a prop but as a grounding force. "Maya," he said, his voice low and warm, like a pastor speaking to a weary soul, "I'm not here to tear down what you've built. I'm not saying every path is wrong. I'm saying I found the one that's right, not because I'm smarter or better, but because it found me." He leaned forward slightly, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a life lived in faith. "When I was lost, Jesus didn't ask me to earn my way to him. He met me where I was broken and all. That's not a theory. It's a lifeline." The audience was silent, their faces a mosaic of emotions, some nodding in agreement, others wiping tears, a few sitting with furrowed brows, wrestling with the implications of his words. Kennedy's voice grew quieter but more intense, as if he were speaking directly to Maya's heart. "You've helped folks find peace, and that's good. But peace that fades when the course ends or the money runs out isn't enough. We need hope that lasts forever, and I believe only Jesus gives that." The studio felt transformed, as if the pretense of performance had melted away, leaving only raw truth in its wake. Maya's hands trembled, more visibly now, her carefully curated facade crumbling under the weight of Kennedy's words. She'd spent her career convincing millions that divinity lay within. That peace could be found through her $2,000 retreats or $500 online courses. Her books, with titles like Awaken Your Inner Light, had topped bestseller lists. Her message, resonating with a world hungry for meaning. But Kennedy's faith, offered freely and rooted in the gritty realities of people like Sarah and Jacob, exposed a gap she'd never confronted. Her work provided comfort, but not salvation. Her empire was built on the idea that all paths led to the same destination. But Kennedy's words suggested otherwise, not with arrogance, but with a quiet urgency that demanded attention. She tried to respond, her voice catching, a trace of defensiveness mingling with vulnerability. "Senator, I've helped millions," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've seen lives change, people finding purpose, joy, strength. Are you saying that doesn't matter because it's not your faith?" Beneath the question lay a deeper fear, one she could barely articulate. What if I've been wrong? Kennedy didn't pounce. Instead, he smiled gently, the kind of smile that disarmed without dismissing. His eyes filled with a compassion that caught her off guard. "Maya, what you've done matters," he said softly. "Kindness always does. But the question isn't whether you've helped people feel better, it's whether you've pointed them to the one who can make them whole. Jesus didn't come to make us comfortable. He came to make us new. That's the difference." His words landed like a quiet thunderclap, reverberating through the studio. The audience sat in stunned silence, some clapping softly, others wiping tears, their faces reflecting a spectrum of reactions: agreement, discomfort, awe. Maya's breath hitched, her mind racing as she grappled with the implications. She'd built her life on the belief that spirituality was a universal tapestry, that her courses and books could guide anyone to peace, regardless of their path. But Kennedy's words, simple yet unyielding, exposed a truth she'd avoided. Her empire offered solace, but it couldn't answer the eternal questions that haunted the human heart. The camera zoomed in, capturing the glistening in Maya's eyes, the steady resolve in Kennedy's face. The audience, many of whom had spent thousands on her programs, felt a stirring in their souls. They'd been drawn to her promise of transformation. But Kennedy's message was different, free, unpolished, and piercingly honest. It wasn't about feeling better, it was about being saved. Maya, her composure fraying, tried to rally, her voice rising slightly as she pushed back. "Senator, you talk about salvation as if it's exclusive to your beliefs," she said, her tone a mix of defiance and desperation. "But what about the wisdom of other traditions? What about the billions who find joy and meaning outside Christianity? Are they all misguided?" The audience clapped, emboldened by her words, their loyalty to Maya reignited. She was their champion, the woman who'd taught them to embrace all paths, to find divinity within themselves. Kennedy's unyielding stance seemed to threaten that freedom, and they rallied behind her, their applause a shield against his challenge. Kennedy didn't flinch. He held the folded letter, his fingers tracing its edges, his voice steady but urgent. "Maya, I'm not here to argue about who's right or wrong," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm here to share what I know. When I was younger, I looked for answers everywhere, books, philosophies, you name it, but nothing filled the hole in my heart until I met Jesus. Not a religion, not a system, but a person who said, 'Come to me, and I'll give you rest.' That's not arrogance, that's surrender. I'm just a man who found a lifeline, and I want to throw it to anyone who's drowning." The words crashed over the audience like a tidal wave, their simplicity belying their power. Some clapped, others sat stunned, their minds wrestling with the weight of his testimony. Kennedy wasn't preaching dogma, he was offering a personal encounter, a truth that had transformed his life and could transform theirs. The audience felt it, their applause growing louder, not just for his words but for the courage behind them. Maya's face crumpled, her eyes glistening as she felt the ground shift beneath her. She'd spent decades building a spiritual empire, convincing millions they could find peace by looking within. Her retreats, her books, her courses, they were a beacon of hope in a chaotic world. But Kennedy's words, rooted in the lives of ordinary people like Sarah and Jacob, exposed a flaw in her vision. Her work offered temporary comfort, but it didn't answer the questions that kept people awake at night. Why are we here? What happens when we die? She stood, her legs unsteady, her voice breaking as she spoke, no longer the polished host but a woman grappling with her doubts. "Senator," she said, her words raw and unfiltered, "I've built my life on helping people, but I've been pointing them to the wrong thing. What does that make me?" The admission hung in the air, a devastating confession that silenced the room. The audience gasped, their hero revealing a vulnerability they'd never seen, her strength giving way to a moment of profound honesty. Kennedy stood too, not to claim victory but to meet her where she was. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice steady but tender, like a friend offering solace. "Maya, it makes you human, just like the rest of us," he said, his eyes shining with compassion. "The good news is, Jesus doesn't need you to have it all figured out. He takes your mistakes, your broken pieces, and makes something beautiful. That's grace." Tears streamed down Maya's face. Not the staged tears of a TV moment, but the raw release of a heart breaking open. The audience, many crying too, watched in awe as their icon knelt not in defeat, but in surrender. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've always been in control." Kennedy knelt beside her, his voice a lifeline in the storm. "That's where he wants you, out of answers, ready to listen. That's where we all start." He looked out at the audience, his gaze encompassing them all, his words carrying a quiet power. "Jesus said, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.' That's not about money, it's about knowing you need him. That's where freedom begins." The studio felt transformed, as if the walls of performance had dissolved, leaving only a sacred space where truth and grace collided. Kennedy prayed quietly, not for show but with a sincerity that drew others in. "Jesus, here's your daughter, Maya," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "She's tired of carrying the weight alone. Show her your love, your truth, your rest." Maya sobbed, her shoulders shaking, not trying to hide her tears. The audience joined in, some praying, others simply holding space for the moments. Holiness, a few whispered their prayers, their voices mingling in a quiet chorus. The cameras captured it, all the tears in Maya's eyes, the steady compassion in Kennedy's face, the audience's awestruck silence. This wasn't a talk show anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place where hearts were laid bare and truth was spoken without pretense. As the show drew to a close, there was no fanfare, no swelling music, just a reverent hush that felt more powerful than any applause. Maya stood, her face softer, her eyes clearer, as if a weight had been lifted. "I don't know what this means for my work," she said, her voice honest and unpolished. "But I know I can't go back to pretending I have all the answers." The audience applauded gently, not for entertainment but for courage, hers and Kennedy's. They had witnessed something rare, a moment of transformation, not scripted for ratings but born of truth and vulnerability. Kennedy folded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket, his heart steady, his prayer answered. He hadn't come to win a debate or to tear Maya down. He'd come to a point of truth bigger than himself, and in doing so, he'd reached not just her but countless others watching. In the months that followed, Maya made a stunning announcement that sent shockwaves through her followers. She was ending her spiritual courses, redirecting her resources to quiet acts of service, visiting hospitals, supporting families in need, sharing the hope she'd found in that moment on the Unity Studios stage. Her retreats, once sold out in hours, were replaced with free community gatherings where she spoke openly about her journey, her doubts, and the grace she'd encountered. Her books remained on shelves, but she no longer promoted them, choosing instead to listen, to learn, to walk a new path. Kennedy continued his work in the Senate, his faith unchanged, but his humility deepened by the experience. He carried Jacob's letter with him, a reminder of why he spoke, why he stood, why he believed. That the lesson of that night lingered, rippling far beyond the studio walls. Truth, when spoken with love, could pierce even the hardest hearts. True faith didn't need flash or profit, it thrived in humility in action. In a world chasing quick fixes and packaged promises, Kennedy's stand was a reminder to seek what lasts: love, grace, and a savior who meets us where we are. The audience, the viewers at home, and Maya herself were left with a question that echoed in their hearts. What are you holding on to, and are you brave enough to let truth reshape it? For Maya, the answer had begun to take shape in that sacred moment, under the stage lights, where a senator's quiet faith had opened a door to a freedom she'd never known. The path to that freedom, as Kennedy had said, started with a single, honest step.